It is my pleasure to welcome you all back for the April installment of the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University Extension Sheep and Goat webinar series. So welcome back to everyone who's joining us today live. And we have a really awesome program ready for you guys today. It's very exciting to me that we get to have Eric Thacker here with us. He's the range specialist for Utah State University. And we're going to talk a little bit about managing grazing during and after drought. And hopefully that won't be the case this year again, but we are coming out of a pretty severe drought. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to share with us today. So welcome, and I'll let you take it over.
Thank you, Melinda. It's good to be with you today. And I promise this will be the last slide that has any cows on it. I didn't get this changed. I've adapted this from a presentation that I've given several times, as you can imagine, over the last 3 years. And so I am going to focus today just on managing after drought, just in a little bit of context, as I've been hopefully providing some information, useful information to producers and agencies about grazing and drought. I've become more and more convinced, looking at data and experience, that what we do after the drought probably matters as much or more than what we do during the drought. In fact, I've about decided that what we do before the drought and what we do after the drought are probably the two most important pieces of how we manage drought. Because once we're in the drought, a lot of our vegetation has adapted and evolved over the years to deal with drought. You know, grasses and forbs will just go dormant. Shrubs will start dropping leaves and different things to kind of hunker down. And so the plants have evolved to deal with drought, and then we lay grazing over the top of that. And so I think what we do after really matters. Get my slides to advance. So on the other hand, there's not a lot of good data that look at drought and grazing or browsing in combination with each other. And so there's two studies I'm going to reference really quickly. And then this kind of gets at the heart of my recommendations about drought. And so I've learned in extension, my job is to provide producers with information. I have the easy job. I'll tell you what the science says, and then you all have to decide what you're going to use and how you're going to use it, and more importantly, how you implement that on your own operation. But here's an example out of Montana. This is a single year drought. It should be pointed out these pastures were all in good condition prior to drought. So you can look, if you look at this top graph, 1993, this was the pre-drought period. You can see that production was pretty similar across all three pastures. Grazing was about the same, except this solid line represents an ungrazed pasture. So it was ungrazed in 94, 95. Then the dotted line, or the dashed line, was grazed only in 94 during the drought, and then rested after. And then the ungrazed pastures, this dotted line, meaning it didn't have any grazing. And so you can see production pre-drought. So it gets a little interesting when we look at production post-drought, although it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out. You graze those areas, it reduces forage production during the drought. And so you can see the departure from, but even the ungrazed plots lost forage production, which rain makes forage. That's no earth-shattering result. But then things, in my opinion, start getting interesting when we look at that 1995 post-drought period. You can see the ungrazed pasture returned to production relatively quickly. You can see the dashed line. This is the pasture that would have been rested in that year following the drought, is returning quickly. It's not quite there, but it's approaching that. By year 2 post-drought, again, the dashed line wouldn't have had any grazing in it in 95 or 96. We can see that production returned to that to be similar to those ungrazed pastures. And then more importantly, as we see this pasture that was grazed during all of these years is also returning to normal or to the ungrazed production. So the point is there is a recovery period following drought. Grazing, and we need to be aware that grazing needs to be managed as such, because we don't return to full production for at least 1 to 2 years following drought. Again, this is from Northern Great Plains in Montana. There's an additional study I found from the opposite end of the spectrum. This is down on the Santa Rita station in Arizona. But the results there's some striking similarities between the results, which gives me confidence that this is a fairly uniform principle. Again, you can see precipitation on the top and forage production on the bottom. So you can see the forage production pretty well kind of bounces around with drought. However, I want you to really focus on this 1942 through 1946 or 48 window right here. So if we go up and look at the precip, you can see we fell below the long-term average. And so we had kind of this several year period where we were just below average, not in a really bad drought, but just below average. And then you look at the responding forage production. I think this is pretty close to what we are all expecting this year. We've been in, some parts of Utah, for example, we've been in 3, 4, 5 years of under that long-term average forage production. We've got a really good year. So you can look at this year, 1946, that bumped way above average. But we see that forage production trailed. And so the conclusion from this study is that forage production is usually about a year lag, meaning even once you return to normal precipitation or above average precipitation or average precipitation, it takes in the neighborhood of a year or more to recover and return to that average or forage production over time. So I think that's really pertinent in a lot of our cases here in the West, and where we've been through, 2000, 2021, in some cases even back a little further than that. We've experienced some drought, some not as severe as others, but largely been below that long-term average. So the take home here is just because we've had a good precip year, which we're experiencing now, also point out that this is all snow. We haven't had any rain yet, which snow's great for shrubs, less so for forbs and grasses. For the forbs and grasses, we really need to see that spring precipitation, that April, May, even into June precipitation is a big deal. An inch of rain in June is a real shot in the arm for your forage production if you can pick up any rain late into June. So that all being said, the two cautions is we should not expect forage production simply because we got a banner snow year to return to what we would normally expect, although we could debate whether there is a normal. But more importantly, the range may need a couple of years to recover from that drought before we could expect to return with full numbers. That's really what it kind of where we get down to brass tacks. Secondarily, we need to be aware of the fact that without rain, all of this snow will be somewhat inconsequential for grass and forb growth. Shrub growth should do really well because they usually key off from more of that winter precipitation than they do the spring or the summer precipitation. So kind of the conclusions they come up with out of this was forage production does not always show a direct response to that precipitation. It appears there's at least or about a year lag. And when you look at multiple years of drought, then that's going to be multiple years to see recovery. So long periods of drought are not overcome with just one single high year, kind of a shot in the arm. So kind of the management recommendations on the back end of this, and this is where I've come back to, is if we've got range in good condition before we move into our next drought, then it's a better likelihood that our range will recover well from the drought. We're building resilience into the system. We just completed a study in northwestern Utah looking at post-fire management on rangeland, and it appears, looking at that data, that the condition of the range prior to the burn sets a ceiling for what we can expect on the back end of all of our restoration efforts, meaning the condition that we enter a drought or the condition we enter a disturbance in really is impactful in kind of setting our expectations for what we should expect on the back end of this management. So restoration of plant vigor and cover may take a few years. And so this is where I think it gets difficult. We've been through drought. Everybody's kind of ready to restock ranges, return to quote unquote normal. But maybe this is a good chance for us to take a pause and say, maybe we ought to do that a little slower, give a range at least a year or so of good, meaningful rest, which means you're not grazing during that active growing season to allow the plants to recover. So this is a statement from Dr. Larry Howery out of University of Arizona. The year following drought should be devoted as much as possible to improving plant vigor and restoring protective residual vegetation and plant litter. Pastures most likely provide the largest increase in forage production should receive the highest priority. So think about, again, where's your best condition range? How do we give it a break to let it recover so that it returns to its full capacity? There's a graph that I took out of this just for brevity that's quite concerning because it shows the range, a particular rangeland losing productivity over time. And I think a lot of times when we lose productivity over time, it's associated with the loss of productivity during a drought, and then the subsequent grazing doesn't allow the plants to recover from that drought. And so you end up with a long-term loss in overall forage production. So why does it matter? And I think we have to go back to kind of the root of the problem, no pun intended, when we look at root responses to grazing. Now, I've only got grass here, but this would be similar for forbs and then also for our shrubs. The bottom line is plants need leaves to photosynthesize. Animals use leaves for forage. So if we take too much of that above ground leaf material off from the plant, grasses, forbs, shrubs, it doesn't matter, then there's a requisite change in the amount of below ground biomass they can sustain. So at some level, if we take too many leaves off above ground, it means we reduce the root mass underground, which has direct implications for long-term survival of plants in a drought scenario. So the old take half, leaf half adage of grazing management is relevant. Now, grasses, it's specifically at 50%. Shrubs, forbs, it's a little bit different, but just keep in mind, for each of those leaves you're removing above ground, there will have to be a change at some level below ground. So with grasses, we see that as long as we're leaving about 50% of the total biomass, 50% of the leaf material above ground active, then the roots don't stop growing, which means they're turning over and remaining healthy, and you're maintaining that below ground root mass. When we get excessive and where we exceed that 50%, and remember, this is over a whole year. That doesn't mean you come in, say in June and graze it down, and then there's a recovery period. It's over the full year. So if you've taken more than 50% of the total year's worth of plant production in a given year. And what we found is when you remove more than 50%, that means that you stop root development and root growth, and then we see a loss in roots. And over the long term, you lose roots and then you lose plants. The other thing that happens, specifically with grasses, but often with forbs in terms of vigor, is not only do we have roots to think about, but how vigorous a plant grows in a given year this year will determine its vigor in the following year. This is part of the reason we see that year lag. So meaning our plants that survived the drought last year, their overall production is going to be reduced because the production of not only producing roots, but producing the growing points, the buds, the apical meristems that will begin emerging here, hopefully in the next few weeks. Those buds were produced last year. So during drought conditions, the plant's is not able to produce as many, so it produces fewer of those growing points, which then again leads to this reduction in overall growth. Again, just pointing to the fact that these plants need a chance to recover, both for that below ground biomass, the roots, and then also to allow it to produce additional growing points for the following year. So those tillers or those stems that you'll see emerging that grow leaves here, hopefully in the next few weeks, at least in northern Utah, we're still a few weeks out for sure. Those were all formed in the previous year. So during drought years, we see fewer tillers formed, which means inherently, irregardless of how good the year is, the following year there will be a drop off in terms of production because the plant is trying to recover from that drought. I think I've beat that to death enough here. I think this picture of an Indian rice grass plant is a really good visualization of exactly what I'm talking about. This picture's from southern Utah. This was following a drought a couple of years ago. I want to point out, it's clear that this Indian rice grass plant at one point in time was much bigger and much more vigorous than it is now. We can see that it's been grazed. We also know it come out of a drought, but I'm just pointing out that there's only, I'm guessing, about 30% of that root crown or that bunch that's still active. So what does that mean in terms of the roots below ground? That means there's only about 30% of the original root mass left from before. So in this same area, there's also plants that did not recover from the drought and they're now dead. So I think this is a good kind of embodiment of exactly what I'm talking about. We couldn't expect this plant to produce the same amount of forage that it would have produced as if that whole crown was still growing and active. So in a real quick take home here to keep me at my 15 minutes. I think the one opportunity we have now is hopefully we are coming out of the drought. So we should already start thinking about what do I need to do in my operation to prepare for the next drought. Droughts are not an anomaly. If you look at the precipitation in Utah, at any given time, you have about a 50% chance that next year will be a drought. You're about guaranteed when you look at long-term, about 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6 will lead to some sort of need to reduce stocking rates on your pastures to make sure that your plants remain healthy. So I think now's the time to start thinking about how to deal with that stuff before the next drought occurs. Because once the drought starts, there's our management options become limited. Again, we probably don't need to talk a whole lot about conservative grazing management should be used during the drought. Again, just think about giving those plants as much opportunity as they need to maintain themselves. Restoration of plant vigor may take time, especially a couple of years following the drought. And that's all assuming that your grazing during the drought was adequate or not excessive. If it's excessive, that it may lengthen that recovery period. For meaningful rest, this means when plants are actively growing. Rest needs to occur during that time when plants are actively growing. Utilization levels over 50% will compound this. One of the things that's recommended in the literature, a more conservative rate, especially in areas that are very dry or areas that may be experiencing drought, is maybe look at utilizing only 30% of that forage versus 50% just to give the plant an additional chance to recover. My hope is that we'll see some significant recovery this year. I think there's some reasons to be optimistic, and we'll just hope for a good April, May, and June rain. And with that, if I have some time, I can take questions.
Thank you. That was a wonderful discussion about that. I'm very excited. So as a reminder to all the attendees, put your questions in the Q&A box. We do have some time. So I guess the very first question that came in, and I know that this can be a little ambiguous, but when we're thinking about the 50% rule, can you capture that at all in a stubble height sort of realm, or what would you say to that?
Yeah, so a good way to get to the 50% rule for most bunch grasses in the Intermountain West, if we're talking bunch grasses, it's about 4 inches. So hence, that's why a lot of Forest Service allotments have gone to a 4-inch stubble height. That's a good way of saying we've left enough vegetation for that plant to maintain its growth. So it's about 4 inches. There are species differences. For example, crested wheatgrass, which is an introduced cool season grass, physiologically can take heavier grazing than the requisite, blue bunch wheatgrass that you'd find on maybe some of those same ranges. It has to do with some physiological differences in growth where they have those growth points. So a lot of our improved forages do hold up better under heavier grazing and even drought. But by and large, the 50% rule is kind of a good catch-all. And remember, that's over the whole season, not just within the time that you're in the pasture.
Right. So with that being said, and I'm gonna expand a little on this question just because we could go a little further with it. But the question is, how do we compensate, especially with sheep and goats, when we're looking at things like trees and shrubs and other forages available when it comes to stocking rate, especially in a drought scenario?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, Melinda, are you getting at the fact that sheep and goats are browsing a lot as well as using those herbaceous species?
That's the way I took it. And
okay,
if you are listening and that's not the way you intend it, let us know.
So I'll answer it 2 different ways, and I'll try to be brief so we can. So number one, if you're worried about keeping trees, especially with things like goats, we know that if they run out of forage, they'll start really chewing on those trees pretty heavily. Back to the way you asked the question, Melinda, I think we should view it all as kind of one and the same, right? Because sheep and goats are able to browse, and that's one of the real advantages to sheep and goats. They have a little bit broader diet selection, but the key is kind of looking at all of that forage in the same, evaluating at the same time. Does that make sense? So they may do a lot of browsing. They will do a lot of browsing, but again, we have to, it might be more like 40% on the browsing, that we don't want them taking more than 40% of those leaves and the leader growth off from, say like sagebrush or bitterbrush or, saltbush or whatever we're looking at. So it's still the same principle. We have to leave leaves on the plant in order to conduct photosynthesis, and that photosynthesis is important because that's what keeps the roots alive below ground. So it's kind of a universal principle, but we do need to consider that with sheep and goats, that it would be more than just the grasses and the forbs. It would also include the browse. Hopefully that answered their question.
Awesome. This says not browsing, but under grasses not being as proficient as ones in open grassland. So the canopy cover of the trees, I guess, is or where we were going with that.
Yeah. So again, I think it's safe to say that principle is the same, right? There are a few situations in the West on our rangelands. Guess I'm not sure exactly where they're at, where light becomes a limiting factor. But I think that's what they're asking about, is the vigor with light being a problem. It would still be the same. Those plants would respond similar. If anything, the shade may help them because it may help keep soil moisture in the ground longer. If they're up under aspen stands, for example, often you'll see things remain green longer there. That's because they retain a little more soil moisture. I hope I'm answering that right. Yeah.
Okay, so this question is related to grazing in the late fall, especially when there's good moisture in the fall. And I guess I'm kind of leaning in this one also. And Lily, again, let us know if we're off tracking, but I'm thinking more as plants are senescing and if there's any sort of change to what we talked about today in those months.
So I've been asked this question a lot. So I think the question is asking specifically, we get some fall rain, so we see some green up. What impact is the grazing having at that point? I don't think there's enough significant growth that you're getting a lot of necessarily like restoration. I don't think they're replacing a lot of roots. There is growth. They do green up. There is some photosynthesis going on. I think it's okay to graze that. Again, just make sure your levels remain moderate. You're not taking too much leaf. Once the vegetation is dormant, then it's kind of inconsequential to the plant whether you remove all the leaf or not, once it's dried out and senesced. There's other things to consider. Your soils, leaving some leaf material in place to protect your soils has some real strong advantages, and it also helps make sure you get more moisture into your soil. So just keep that in mind. I like to help people think about grazing. Instead of asking how much I can take, ask how much do I need to leave in terms to maintain the vigor of the grass and also just maintain the soils.
Okay. So we have a question about how grazing affects the fertility of sheep, but I'm actually going to pass that one to our next speaker.
Yep.
Because I think he's going to touch on that. And if not, we'll get to that at the end of that discussion. But there is a question about reseeding after a drought and whether or not that would be appropriate, especially if it's an irrigated system.
So in an irrigated system, I think that's a much easier question because your likelihood of success is quite high. So if it makes sense for you, economic sense, go for it. I have learned that our systems are pretty resilient if we give them a chance to recover. So I guess making that decision, I would encourage you to look at what's left after the drought as things are recovering. If you've decided you've lost a lot of your grass, then maybe it would justify the cost and expense. Because the other thing to consider is if you seed it, you're going to need to stay off it for at least 2 growing seasons to let those perennial plants establish. So there's the cost of doing the treatment, then the cost of I've got to have those animals somewhere else for 2 growing seasons to get my pasture established. So it all kind of comes down to what, kind of making an economic decision in that frame of reference.
And then the last question that I'm going to take now, but we may have time after our next speaker to finish up this conversation. But do you have any advice as far as having a large pasture that you're maybe doing some longer term grazing in a more open area versus sectioning or fencing to do more intensive grazing?
That's kind of a loaded question. I think a lot of it depends on the style of operation you want. I'm relatively convinced that the most important thing is you have very specific objectives that you're grazing to. There are some advantages, especially on irrigated pasture, to smaller pastures, moving animals rapidly. Recognize there's costs with that. Animal performance often declines a little bit because you're moving animals more, things like that. That's according to the data. That's not, however, I've also clearly seen some advantages to the rotational systems. I think a lot of it comes back to how labor intensive you want your operation to be, and if it makes sense. Overall, I think as long as you have very specific objectives of what you're grazing to make sure that you're meeting your goals in terms of maintaining the long-term sustainability of your forage plants, shrubs, grasses, it doesn't matter, then I think that's probably the biggest key. And then just finding a system that works well with you and adapting it to your system. I will warn and caution everybody, there is no one size fits all recipe. It just doesn't exist. Everybody I know that's implemented some sort of rotational system and been successful, they've started with some sort of a system and then they've adapted it, heavily adapted it to their specific needs. So that's why I'm getting at, there's not one size in terms of even pasture size. That's all depends on a lot of factors, a lot of which are logistical.
Yep, I agree, absolutely. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing this information. I recognize that we probably didn't give Eric enough time to really get into the depth of this topic, and also that we didn't probably answer all of your questions. So feel free to reach out to him and also stay on with us. Eric, are you planning to stay on with us?
Yeah, I'll stay on.
And so we can maybe get to a few more at the end. But that being said, thank you very much. And Chad, if you would like to take over the sharing and get yours popped up.
Well, I'm a little disappointed. I was thinking Eric was going to give us a one-size-fits-all solution to all of our problems.
Yeah,
You know,
I know. What the heck?
I've been toting to all my friends that Eric, is the best, that he would fix all our problems. But can you guys see my whole screen? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay.
So I'll introduce you so that you can run with it. So we are welcoming back our co-host, Chad Page, sheep and goat specialist for Utah State University. And today he's going to visit about body condition and nutritional needs in a seasonal capacity with our sheep and goats, and sort of bring around some of the discussion that we just had about grazing management. And so welcome, and I will let you take off with this topic. Thanks, Chad.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. So I guess the reason I had been thinking about this topic, and one of the reasons that we reached out to Eric, is just the somewhat extreme winter that a lot of us had, and the effects that it had on, one, our management, and then two, our animals. And so thinking about what we can do to, Eric did a really good job describing on what we could do to, change our rangeland, or how we should treat it, after these big drought events or things like that. I've been thinking of, well, what can we do now to maybe manage our animals a little bit differently, or at least start assessing where we're at. So I asked a producer for some pictures of this winter to try to give us an idea of, how tough this winter was on a lot of people through, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana. There's been a lot of snowfall, but I know that the entirety of the US has had some pretty extreme weather this year. And so that has forced us to have to change some management decisions. Maybe it has just made the animals lose some body condition, maybe lose some weight as we are going through, you know, our breeding season and then through gestation as we're coming up to lambing for a lot of our producers, or maybe, you know, we've already started dropping lambs and now we're thinking about how things are going to go. But I think these pictures point out pretty clearly the extent of the cover that the snow had. This picture, you know, being in Wyoming, here's another one here that kind of shows the amount of snow coverage over some of those plants that Eric was talking about that do provide so much nutrition. And when you think of some of those most valuable plants out on rangeland, things like salt sage, they don't grow quite as tall as some of the others. And so enabling your sheep or your goats that are maybe out on range to get some of those plants can be difficult. So one thing that I've been thinking about, and one reason that, you know, as we as producers on maybe more extensive operations try to lamb the time we do, one, our animals are, you know, seasonal polyestrous, so they breed, they're short day breeders, but also a lot of our management decisions, and when we turn in our rams or our bucks for the first time, generally we're calculating out to when those kids and lambs are going to drop. And oftentimes we try to match our nutrition requirements with our forage availability, okay? And so depending on what plant species you have, and Eric would probably be better suited at talking about this than me, but here's a kind of a rough graph of showing the cool season and warm season grass growth curves. Now, depending on the species you have, these growth curves could be different. Maybe your operation where you're at is majority warm season grasses, or maybe it's the majority of cool season grasses. And so to try to eliminate that one big cost that all of us have in feeding, generally we try to match up our nutrition requirements with those growth curves, right? Maybe some operations don't. So if we're showing lambs, oftentimes we're lambing and kidding in January, so that the objective of our operation is to have larger lambs when we go to market those lambs, and then ultimately for the fair, for the show. But if you can see here in this graph, I kind of have the energy requirements of a 154 pound ewe, so moderate sized ewe, through different production cycles, right? And so we have maintenance, breeding, early gestation. You kind of see the difference between the two. One being raising twins has a greater requirements overall during gestation and lactation. But those highest requirements are going to be in early lactation and peak lactation. So oftentimes we either try to have turnout around that time, but this year, often, you know, we because of the winter we had, we might want to assess a little bit differently where our animals are at, and if we need to do any additional management in order to get them where they need to be. So one very easy and economic tool that I think we do use as producers, but we could use even more, is body condition scoring. And I'm a huge fan of this, right? When we're talking about maintenance of an animal or the nutritional requirements of an animal, there are some things that come to a highest priority versus the lowest priority. And so maintenance comes number one, maintaining that animal, right? The growth of that animal, and then ultimately goes into those things like lactation or fetal growth, maintaining pregnancy, breeding up, and then ultimately putting on body reserves, right? So what is body condition scoring? It's essentially us measuring those reserves, that body fat reserve, on our sheep or goats during various stages of production. Okay, this aids us in management decisions, formulating rations or making feeding decisions, or where we may want to bring them to different areas out on range, or maybe a different pasture if we have one pasture that's higher quality than another. Doing simple body condition scoring can be an effective tool in allowing us to change some of those things that we need to. Kind of going back to that highest priority versus lowest priority. This is kind of one of those reasons that I like to tell my students that reproduction really is something that is, what is the word? So reproduction is something that doesn't come lightly, right? It's after everything is met and those requirements are met, reproduction comes last. And so oftentimes we talk about this in the cattle industry, but it works the same with our sheep and goat operations. So how do we body condition score? Jokingly, I throw this picture up of this ram, right, that was let go. I believe this was Chris the sheep or Shrek, one of those sheep, and it kind of gets the point across. It's meant to be funny, but ultimately with our sheep, when they have a larger fleece on them, it is harder for us to determine what kind of body condition scoring they have, right? And so how do we go about doing that? What do we need to do? And ultimately, we need to get our hands on these animals. And so every time we get the opportunity, and it's a little bit harder in some of our more extensive operations where maybe we don't have as many opportunities to get hands on our animals, but when we do, we should take advantage of it, right? And so what we want to do is feel through that wool and palpate across that spinous process and the transverse process just behind the last ribs. And that gives us a good idea of how much flesh is on that animal. I put a link here to a pretty good diagram that our collaborators, Dr. Kelly Froelich and Jaylyn Whaley from South Dakota State University have put out. And unfortunately, this is set to the back, but it shows a diagram of kind of what these animals would look like. And I'll show another picture of these in just a second to go back to them. But in the diagram, we generally score with sheep and goats a 1 to a 5, 1 being extremely emaciated, 5 being very obese and fat. And there are different times in our production systems where our animals should be, or it's more appropriate for them to be at different body condition scores. Okay, so this is a natural thing, right? This body condition score will change with time and throughout the year, especially as we're making our animals essentially work for us and making us money. So it's a normal thing. Knowing the production of your ewes will allow you to anticipate the different nutritional needs and prepare to bring those ewes back to an ideal body condition score. So I kind of scoured a bunch of different literature and looked at a lot of different recommendations on where animals should be and different body condition scores and some different literature. And ultimately, it kind of goes back to a graph similar to this one, where it gives you your stage of production, whether they're dry, so this would be a true maintenance period for sheep. Then you go into breeding, early gestation, and all the way through gestation into lactation, and then ultimately weaning. And through that time, we should probably increase our body condition score, and we'll talk about this in just a second with breeding. And then going right before lambing or kidding, we want to make sure that our body condition score is adequate. So in this example, it gives a 3.5 as our ideal body condition score going into lambing and kidding. Because right after that, like we'd shown in earlier slides, we see that highest demand nutritionally will be the time during lactation. Early lactation and peak lactation are those most demanding times. And so we need to make sure that our body condition scores are high enough going into that, so that when those animals do start pulling reserves in order to feed those lambs and produce milk to the volume that they need to, that they can do so adequately without their own maintenance suffering much, right? Another thing to think about is in late gestation, one thing that is common with sheep and goats is a pregnancy toxemia, right? Sometimes we call this ketosis, or we call this twin lamb disease. But ultimately, it's that inability for that ewe to have enough blood glucose in her system to maintain herself, because at that time in late gestation, that blood glucose will be shunted to the lambs and given to the lambs. Okay, looks like my laptop, I'm out at the farm today, so my laptop's telling me it's pretty low, but we'll get through this. So here's a good body condition score. So it's about 12 to 14% of the mature weight of your animals that will change a body condition score, essentially one score up or down. Okay, so for example, say your ewes are generally 175 pounds in a maintenance, requirement, or maintenance weight. Now, if you had ewes, that normally sat at that were a body condition score 2, they're probably a little bit closer to 150 pounds at that time, right? But there are a lot of different things that affect this that we should keep into consideration with our ewes. So what kind of growth are they? Are they yearlings? Are they still developing? Are they ewe lambs that we've been trying to breed? Lactation, how prolific are they as far as lactation, or dairy goats? This is something that we want to think about with our dairy goats. And then how many lambs or kids are they dropping? Are we expecting as producers for them to take care of? Some environmental factors that would affect our lambs and our ewes would be, how tough is the terrain that we're asking them to work in? Putting that reminder picture at the bottom of those ewes having to work out in the deep snow this winter, those increase our requirements, nutritional requirements. Heat and cold stress is a thing with sheep. It's, that thermal neutral zone that we often talk about with cattle or goats. It's a little bit wider, especially with a full fleece on a sheep. But a minimum temperature for a freshly shorn sheep, maintenance level is around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. About 40% additional energy above maintenance may be needed for lower temperatures around 0. And then if wind is even greater, if we have really strong winds, that could even limit some of the effectiveness of a full fleece. And so these are all things that we should keep in mind when we're thinking how much our animals need. So here's some other things to think about as we're looking at ideal body condition scores. With males, our rams and our bucks, they really have one job. Most of the year, we could maybe maintain them at a little bit lower body condition score because they're not working oftentimes as hard as our ewes are. But when it is time to work, 4 weeks prior, we should start making sure that we can push them up into a body condition score of roughly a 3 or a 3.5, and knowing that they'll probably lose a whole body condition score, roughly 15% of their weight, going into the breeding season and throughout the breeding season. So if they're going in at a lower body condition score of a 2.5, they may not have enough energy stores to make it through that season as successfully. And a lot of research has shown that emaciated rams are much more likely to have subpar semen parameters, mainly around motility and morphology. So they wouldn't be able to cover as many ewes. Think about our females and body condition scores. If we do have some ewes in a lower body condition score, and around breeding, we push them up into a higher body condition score, say we're going from a 2.5 to a 3.5, that actually elicits a little bit stronger of a flushing response in our ewes than if they were already at a higher body condition score. However, there is still an effect even when you're thinking about just increasing nutritional plane overall. So if you are already have your ewes or your does at a higher body condition score, you still will see some kind of flushing response, just not quite as strong. Ideally, your ewes should be above a body condition score of a 3 before being exposed to rams. And then as you move into late gestation, when we start thinking about pregnancy toxemia, or we start thinking about lactation that's right around the corner, we want to make sure they're actually a little bit higher than a 3. look at something closer to a 3.5, maybe even pushing up to a 4. So why, should we consider body condition scores? And this is kind of, this talk that I'm giving isn't meant to be super scientific. It's more kind of quick and dirty. Are we assessing where our animals are at right now after the type of winter that we've had? If we need to change some things to get them to where they should be before as lambs are dropping, and if so, we probably might need to supplement a little more if they are lower body condition score, or maybe because we've been feeding them throughout this winter, they already are at an adequate body condition score. And these can help us hopefully save money in the long run by not giving as much food if we don't need to, if they are at an effective body condition score. But ultimately, this is just a very cost-effective way of making some management decisions, and it just really requires your time, your attention, and also some note taking. So here's kind of an example of an assignment that I kind of run through with a lot of my students. I make them go through and essentially make a bar graph or a histogram on body condition scores with our sheep here at USU, and kind of looking at where they were right after shearing and late gestation. And you can see that not all of our ewes were right at that 3.5 body condition score where we want them, but a lot of them tended to be that way, maybe with some on the lower end and some a little bit on the higher end. But this is a good way to kind of see where your average lies amongst your animals. And you don't have to do all your animals, right? If you have a larger operation and you want to do randomly a couple alleyways full, this still gives you a good idea of where you're at and what you could do different, or just keep doing, just assure yourself that you're doing things right. So with that, I hope this was helpful. If anything, just a good reminder to all of us to continually assess where our animals are, depending on whatever curveball is thrown our way year to year. So with that, if anyone has questions, I'll go ahead and try to take those. I know, Melinda, if you saw my battery thing pop up on my screen while I was presenting, but my computer.
I don't think it came through on our end, but
okay.
We'll keep it somewhat brief for you.
Okay.
And we'll understand if you disappear what happened.
Okay, thank you.
So reminder to everyone, if you have questions, to go ahead and pop them in the Q&A box. We do have a question right off the bat, which is someone who's experiencing an unusual large number of lambs in their lambing season this year, but not having done anything differently. Could this be attributed to a better overall body condition score, or do you think there were some other factors also?
I mean, I'm not, I mean, that's hard to say if you're saying nothing has changed, right? We think of, genetics or nutrition. If we're thinking of, maybe your animals did get a little bit better nutrition this last year before your breeding season, before other years. But, it's hard to say without knowing exactly, your operation and what kind of animals you're using and things like that. But like some of that research says that, if they do go up on a little bit better plane of nutrition, you can expect a greater flushing response. And actually those ewes and does will actually ovulate more eggs, and that actually can increase your lamb crop. So as far as it pertains to this talk, maybe, but I don't know for sure. So
yeah, I think one of the things to keep in mind with that is also that without actually testing the nutritional value of your hay and your feed, that you really don't have a super good understanding of the nutritional value. So for example, if you're feeding your same hay that you usually feed, this year's crop could have been a little more nutritious, or the batch that you got right before flushing could have been better. So that's something that contribute, as well as if the weather is a little nicer during breeding, or there's a number of factors that I think can play into that. So that's something to think. If you guys have any more questions, I will try to keep responding. It looks like we lost Chad. So the next question is whether we would recommend molasses for use in late gestation as a toxemia preventative, no matter what the body condition score or certain body condition scores. So when it comes to pregnancy toxemia, certainly the animals that are more at risk are going to be your very thin or your very obese user dose. And I don't personally think that it's that beneficial to just give molasses regardless. But if you have animals that are in those two categories, I think that that's when you can adjust some of your feeding strategies to fit that risk. So if you have animals that are very thin, and the biggest thing there too is if they are not on a high plan of nutrition and they're thin, I would certainly bump the plan of nutrition as much as possible, and then also maybe apply something like molasses. But I actually would even consider more adding some fats to the diet and that type of thing as well. So it's certainly, in my mind, sort of situation dependent. But no, I would not do molasses just as a general rule for everybody, regardless. So I don't see any more questions coming in. So I appreciate our speakers today, Eric and Chad, bringing you guys this information. This was a great webinar today. And thank you all for joining in person. And as always, you can find our past webinars on our YouTube channel, the University of Idaho Extension Livestock YouTube channel. And we post those each time to that channel, so you can catch up on them. And we are looking forward to having you back in May for our next webinar, and we will see you then. Have a great spring.